Hi, Peter.
Good morning, Nicole.
Peter Blackmer is an assistant professor of Africology and African American Studies at Eastern Michigan University. His research explores Black-led grassroots organizing campaigns for self-determination in the 20th and 21st century United States and in American cities. He's currently working on a book that explores the local dynamics and national implications of Black freedom struggles in Harlem during the Civil Rights era. His work on Detroit has similarly centered the voices of grassroots organizers and local people who envisioned and fight for a radically different world in the face of institutional racism and violent repression. Blackmer is the lead researcher for the North, Civil Rights and Beyond in Urban America, a national digital humanities project on Black freedom struggles in the urban North based in Newark, New Jersey. His work and activism promotes public humanities and community-driven research. So welcome. Thank you, Peter, for meeting with my students and with the city and all other interested parties. We're here to talk about, you've really done a lot of work thinking about community organizing. And I think the average person doesn't know what that means. What is community organizing and how do different groups go about it?
I mean, at a very basic level, it's people in a neighborhood. And by neighborhood, I mean anything from one particular block to an entire neighborhood in the city. Building relationships and coming together to resolve problems and to build institutions that represent the interests that they seek to achieve in their neighborhood. And I mean, there's a lot of times when we think about community organizing that turns into a perspective of simply being about like social justice organizing. But a lot of times when we look at community organizing historically, when movements emerge for social justice, for racial justice, for Black liberation, those organizations a lot of time are built upon relationships that already existed in the community through different institutions, whether that's block clubs or whether that's athletic teams or whether that's particularly in Black communities, churches, the kind of institutions and relationships that create a social fabric in a community that people will then build upon to organize power to achieve certain demands. And I think at a very basic level, that's what it means to me. And when we talk about grassroots organizing, we're talking about local people engaging with issues that impact their lives.
Now, are there different like structures of community organizations? For instance, do wealthier communities have different ways of organizing?
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, when I think about that question, it's one about what are our access to resources and influence, and how do we make the most out of the resources that we have within our communities. Now, with wealthier communities, there's generally greater access to people in positions of power. And if you have that immediate access to people in positions of power, whether that's business leaders or political officials or what have you, that creates a much different form of organizing and engagement than folks who don't have the same level of access to power. Because in that situation, it could be as much as getting on the phone and asking for a favor, or getting on the phone and applying direct pressure to somebody that knows you and understands the power and the positionality that you hold in the community. Now, on the other hand, particularly for working class and poor communities, there's generally not that kind of access to power. And this is directly related to institutional racism, segregation, and the way that power and privilege is segregated in our country. So folks in poor and working class neighborhoods have to be more creative about the ways that they seek to build power within their communities and then make demands of power structures. And when we look at the civil rights and Black power movements, that looked like a very conscious evolution from one of building power to make demands upon an institution, institution being whether that's local, state, or federal levels of government, or private industries, to demonstrate the kind of power that was necessary to exact concessions or to force institutions to act upon the demands of the people. And then by the time we're seeing this evolution into the period that is more characterized by the Black Power movement, there's a shift and there's an evolution in thinking to a position that, well, why are we asking people that don't really care about us or that don't represent our interests to act on our behalf? Why aren't we the ones who are acting on our own behalf? So in some instances that looked like seeking power through electoral politics, through getting in positions of power, so that the interests of the people were represented in those rooms and in those spaces. Now that's a whole chapter in our nation's history that we're really just starting to explore and understand about what it looked like when, like particularly during the era of Black mayors in the early 1970s, and then with Black congressional representatives and the like. And there's a lot to talk about there. But it also looked like creating independent institutions. And this is coming out of traditions of anti-colonial struggle throughout the African diaspora, of creating essentially liberated territories, where communities sought to create social, economic, and political autonomy that was free from the inherent oppression of the power structures under which communities lived. And sometimes that required negotiation between the two positions, and they're not mutually exclusive or by any means the only ways that people organize. But those are two kind of broad themes that were coming about by the late 60s, and that I think a lot of organizations in Detroit are drawing from today, because when we think about who have been some of the leading grassroots organizers in this city for many years, it's folks that have been, folks that are a bit older, that have been a part of Detroit's Black radical tradition for many years, like folks like Malik Yakini, that grew up in this city and learned from Black radical thinkers, Black radical organizers during the 1960s and 1970s. They're steeped in Pan-Africanism, steeped in anti-colonial thought and action. Folks like Helen Moore, who was part of Black Parents for Quality Education, who also, as a child during the 1943 riot, was forced to be locked into her school because there were armed white mobs patrolling throughout the city, and the children were saved because their parents came with their guns and led them home safely from that school. So these traditions are very deep in the city of Detroit and have great resonance today, and really inform the organizing work that people are doing now in 2020, because so many of the problems that folks have been organizing around for such a long time remain unresolved.
You know, I really appreciate that you bring up this issue of alternate institutions. I think, you know, when we think about, I don't know if this is true, but I imagine when most Americans think about Black Power, you know, they think about Malcolm X, and they think about maybe Harlem, right? And I don't think that we're present to how many Black-led movements for self-determination originate in Detroit. And it's apropos you bring up Helen Moore's activism, because we do see this sort of older way of organizing, right, in the 60s in Harlem and Detroit, especially around the schools, you know, with the desire to have Black-controlled curriculum and Black-controlled schools. And I wonder if you could tell us what distinguishes, right, that the sort of old school from the new school, because what a rich moment now to think about Black Lives Matter and the way that a lot of claims have been unfolding downtown.
Yeah, I think an important part of that, in terms of the way that the history is remembered and understood, is that we live in a society where the dominant narratives of history are really filtered through the lens of the great man theory, where history is made by individuals, and they're usually men. They're usually charismatic leaders. And in our nation, it's usually white men that define the history. But in the case of when we talk about Black freedom struggles, it's still largely Black men that we identify as the leaders of civil rights and Black power movements. We talk about Martin Luther King, we talk about Malcolm X, we talk about Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, but it's not very often that we popularly talk about Ella Baker or Mae Mallory, or, you know, any Kathleen Cleaver with Black Panther Party, or Angela Davis. You know, so there's so many Black women that we know their names, and there's a lot of us historians that are doing work and trying to make sure that these narratives are centered in the way that we talk about history. But to come back to, I think that question is between the old school and the new school. God, I mean, there's changing contexts right now. And so I think it's important to like ground an analysis in that we are living in a different time, politically, economically, socially, and at the same time, there are a lot of direct lessons that we can learn from this. I mean, when we talk about the schools, it's such a complicated and long history in the city of Detroit. When we look at the 1960s in the city of Detroit, there's so much vibrant organizing going on around education. One of the leading figures in that is the Reverend Albert Clegg, who was very active in organizing parents as early as 1962 at the Sherrill School. Students were leading walkouts by the mid-1960s in Northern, and spread to Northwestern. And on the topic of creating alternate institutions, during the walkouts at Northern in 1966, and there's plenty of information available online around this. riseupdetroit.org is one spot that more information can be found. So I'll spare the details, but essentially, and this was common across the country, whether that was in New York or Chicago or in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, when there were walkouts, when education wasn't available to Black students, and really when we're talking about the walkouts in Detroit, we're talking about organized responses to unjust and inequitable education. Both in terms of curriculum that was not reflective of the community, racist teachers in the schools, and administrators for that matter. And really the bigger picture just being that there was no quality education being provided to Black students, which is something that is still an issue here, as we know with the right to literacy case. But the point being that when there were walkouts to protest educational injustice, it wasn't just a matter of walking out of school. There was also freedom schools that were created. And there are plenty of folks who are still around in the city of Detroit right now that were involved with the freedom schools that are eager to talk with students or talk with anybody who's interested in learning. Folks like Frank Joyce, who's a white anti-racist activist, was around for the beginnings of the Northern student movement in Detroit, and went on to be a leader in People Against Racism, which is one of the very few national white anti-racist organizations during the civil rights and Black power eras that not so many folks know about. Carl Gregory, who is a professor at Wayne State University, was, I think, the principal of the Freedom Schools. And folks like Mama Aneb, Dr. Gloria House, was active in the Southern Civil Rights Movement with SNCC, and has carried that tradition of freedom schooling up through this period with up to 2020, the current moment, with the Detroit Independent Freedom Schools movement, with her and so many other folks that have been involved with that as well, like Aurora Harris from We the People of Detroit, Tom Stevens, and so many others. And I think it's also important to note that part of a bridge for that was the establishment of African-centered schools in the city of Detroit, like Aisha Shule and the Saroma Institute, so many spaces that were responding to a lack of African-centered curriculum, instruction, community during a period in which, I mean, we're talking about the late 70s into the 80s and 90s, a period in which the city of Detroit was majority Black, and the schools and the curricula did not reflect that. So people making a conscious effort to create independent institutions that resembled the kind of society that they wanted to live in.
You know, it wasn't my intention to focus so much on education, but it does. I appreciate how you're talking about, you know, the ways that we focus on men when often it's the women who are doing all of the organizing to bring people out, for example, to a protest. And I think the other thing that we forget is that it's a lot of youth, right? The very same, you know, kids who are going through these high schools, who are coming into our classrooms, you know, at EMU or here at Wayne State, are the ones who have really suffered the decline, right? Because I don't see, you know, since the late 60s that we can say, wow, schools have really improved overall. And yeah, apropos you mentioned, you know, the literacy case of the US Supreme Court, but that's something that I want to push, because how do we make sense of what's happened to schools? We talked about, can you tell us a little bit about PA 4 and 436, you know, what that means for Detroit's economy, and then obviously how that might affect the schools?
Yeah, so that's, it's such a long and really awful history for the city.
But you know, I don't think that it's clear. Like even a high level overview. I think most Detroiters are not, you know, we're sort of in the, you know, when you go through a battle and you're in the battlefield, you're like, what just happened? I mean, I don't mean to laugh, but it's tough to get your head around. So
Yeah.
can you explain to us what that is, what emergency management is, what bankruptcy was, and what happened with the schools?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important to ground any of these kind of conversations in is the period preceding emergency management, preceding state takeovers. And because the dominant narratives surrounding the economic decline of the city of Detroit has been one that essentially casts blame upon Black leadership and Black people. From the day that Coleman Young was elected, even before that, the racist narratives that were used to try to maintain white control of power structures in the city of Detroit were that Black people were not capable of governing themselves. And we see that throughout Coleman Young's administration. So it's important to really name those and to push back against those in the sense of the economic position of the city, because what we've seen from the 1950s onward is a massive disinvestment in the city of Detroit that was subsidized by the federal government. When we talk about particularly the post-war era of the late 1940s, early 1950s, the federal government is investing massive resources into essentially the construction of the suburbs. Right. So we're talking about the construction of highways, Federal Housing Administration, and making low interest and low cost loans available to families on a discriminatory basis. And so white people are getting access to low cost home loans, essentially subsidizing white home ownership, which has been a driving force of intergenerational wealth accumulation over the years and over the decades. And at the same time, the creation of the suburbs are being created by building highways smack dab through the middle of Black communities. White communities don't get destroyed for highway construction. We see that nationwide. In Detroit, that meant the destruction of Black Bottom, the destruction of Paradise Valley, predominantly Black communities on the city's Lower East Side. In Southwest Detroit, that meant building I-75 smack dab through Mexican Town. Right. So these, without getting too deep into the weeds, what we saw from the 1950s onward was a mass disinvestment in the city and a mass investment in the creation of the suburbs. So the common narratives are that white flight really emerged after the 1967 rebellion, which is garbage because white flight had been happening since the early 1950s because of this kind of federal subsidization of suburbanization. And it's also important to note that in Detroit too, that was subsidized by the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department. Many of these suburban municipalities would not exist if they did not have access to the DWSD, the world-class water infrastructure, that the costs have been borne inequitably. Detroiters have historically subsidized water rates for suburban customers. Again, a whole can of worms that I won't get into. But the picture I'm trying to paint here is that beginning in the 1950s, there's this mass disinvestment in the city of Detroit. And of course, it does get exacerbated after the 1967 rebellion. People are leaving at a greater rate, but the process started long before that. And from the 70s into the 80s, when there's this essentially national backlash against the gains of the civil rights movement, which we're really feeling resonance of right now in just how violent this current administration is and how hostile this current administration is to notions and demands for Black liberation. This federal backlash against the city of Detroit and other majority Black cities meant really slashing revenue sharing, slashing financial support that was available to cities. And so when you combine that lack of federal support to the mass disinvestment of white communities and the mass exodus of industries from the city of Detroit, we're painting a picture of massive decline, of economic decline. And most of these opportunities that were available to white people they were expressly forbidden to Black people. So Detroit became hyper segregated. That's not to say that some Black families didn't escape and flee to the suburbs from the 70s into the 80s as economic hardships really increased. So we see a lot of Black families in Southfield, particularly, and other inner ring suburbs in Detroit metropolitan area. So that's all the backdrop that really needs to be acknowledged before we can even talk about emergency management and bankruptcy. So the popular notion that was pushed by people in power during the 1990s and 2000s was that, well, the answer to this is private industry. We need to privatize city assets and city resources because it will make cities more efficient, leaner, and cities are incapable of handling their financial crises on their own. And this again has a long history. Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine is a wonderful resource for better understanding this progression of neoliberalism and privatization of public assets. So from the people that I talk to, and the way that I understand this progression in the city of Detroit is this. The state of Michigan is routinely pushing for control over the city of Detroit under the guise of shoring up the city's financial positions. And the state at the same time is financially culpable in this because they cut revenue sharing, which was a vital lifeline to the city of Detroit as well. So there's this progression of state bills that are trying to take over the DWSD, which is part of a long struggle for control of that valuable city asset. And when we talk about PA4 and PA 436, we're talking about state bills that were introduced that gave the state of Michigan the power to take over the financial powers and really the entire governmental powers of any municipality in the state of Michigan. And that has been unequally applied to Black communities. And with PA4, when that was introduced during the Snyder administration, there was a massive organizing campaign that sought to repeal that bill through referendum. And it was ultimately successful, which is a remarkable period in the state's history of building that kind of statewide organizing campaign that was interracial, cross-class alliances were built because people saw what that meant, that the state could essentially come in and determine that any municipality's finances were in a state of emergency and therefore warranted the state taking over that particular municipality. And for a lot of cities that are along the water, as it was explained to me, there was a fear that the state would come in and parcel out all that waterfront land to hotel developers, and amongst others. So ultimately this campaign is successful, but during the lame duck session, Rick Snyder and his accomplices forced through PA 436, which is essentially the exact same bill, but there's a rider in it that makes it referendum proof. So there's so much to this and so much to unpack, and I'm going to stop there because I feel like that's generally a high level overview of it. Mm-hmm. But it also goes back a little bit into the 90s with PA 72, and there's plenty of resources available that make all of these different bills much more accessible and understandable. I'd be happy to share that can explain them more succinctly than I can right now. But as it pertains to the Detroit Public School District, the state takeover of the Detroit Public School District came in a direct response to a massive bond that was passed in the city of Detroit, something like $1.5 billion in bond money. And as so I'm going to just present the way that many Detroiters, particularly grassroots organizers, have explained it to me, is that the state took over the Detroit Public School District in 1999 initially because they wanted the bond money. They wanted the power of the purse. They wanted to be able to determine who is going to get contracts for infrastructure repair, for school renovations and the like. Because at that time, although the dominant narratives are that enrollment was declining and that test scores were dropping, that's not borne out in evidence. That enrollment was actually steady and increasing, and that test scores were increasing, and that the debt was insignificant, generally speaking, compared to how it is now. And that the sole reason that the state took over the DPS was to get access to that bond money. And that's how Detroit educational activists understand this. And that runs directly counter to the dominant narratives that continue to be pushed. I mean, that was what the state's attorney was arguing in Cincinnati last year during the right to literacy case. It just continuing to repeat these lies. And I don't use the term lightly. I use it in the sense of like, in this particular moment when there's so many like mealy-mouthed pundits out there, and so much just whitewashing of language and of history, that we just need to name things for what they are. And there's just these continued lies about the history of the DPS that aren't borne out in facts. And when you talk to people that have been parents or have been advocates and have been in this game for a long time, they will give you a much different story than the newspapers and policymakers will.
You know, I really appreciate, Professor Blackmer, that you keep talking about the national and then the state and then the city. I really like that sort of telescoping out and using the microscope to come back in, because, you know, apropos your reference to shock doctrine, Naomi Klein wrote that book right after Hurricane Katrina, right? Where, you know, you start to see at the level of the federal government, the ways that no bid contracts could be used in order to curry political favor, right, on the Hill at the expense of the local economy and local developers. who then become subcontractors and then at the mercy, right, of the sort of larger political bodies. And so apropos thinking about the state and how the state has, first with the schools and then with the emergency manager law, basically, I guess what I don't understand is, on the one hand, we're talking about all of these really active communities, right? And community folk who are trying to improve things like whatever, empty lots or abandoned homes or protecting squatters or, what have you. There's so many things that community members have gone to bat for to work for. But what does that mean when you can impose an emergency manager and all of a sudden any democratically elected body is powerless? How do Detroiters continue to find hope and continue struggling for a better city?
I mean, it's a great question, and people don't talk about this enough. Like whether we're in Detroit or elsewhere, like that emergency management has a law that's on the books in the state of Michigan and other places as well. That this exists is an affront to a democratic society. And it's something that there's not enough people that have been just absolutely outraged about. I remember when I first got to Detroit and I was learning about emergency management and all the symptoms of emergency management and just the absolute devastation of the city that the emergency manager, Kevin Orr, and his good buddy, Mike Duggan, brought upon this city. The thought that just kept coming to my mind was, my God, this is madness. And it, when we talk about, I keep coming back to narratives too, because it's important for the way it's, from a materialist perspective, it informs the ways that people understand the material realities of a society. And so when I say that, I mean that the dominant narratives largely serve to justify and often to mask the material machinations that are at play. So when I was living on the East Coast at the period in which Detroit was entering emergency management and then with bankruptcy being declared, the dominant narratives across the country were, well, Detroit just has had a tough period of financial decline, and now it's coming back because
right.
Emergency management, bankruptcy, and this is essentially a fresh start, right? Which is, it's again coming back to the point that you raised about zooming in and zooming out from local to national to global. This has been the progression by which capital seeks to find new markets. It's to essentially create a blank slate in places. Sometimes that's through policy, other times it's through violent suppression, as we saw particularly in South America and Philippines. There's long histories of this, that capital is trying to create a blank slate for free market capitalism to run amok and to feast on public assets and institutions. So that's getting a little bit off track to your question about how people continue to find hope. And there's some folks that give into despair. That's just the reality of the human condition, right? Like people respond in a variety of ways wherever you are to situations of extreme adversity. And so in Detroit, in response to emergency management, people were resisting this all along. When PA 436 was passed during the lame duck session, people took that as like a gut punch. I've asked several folks about what happened to that statewide organizing campaign in response to 436. There was that massive body that was mobilized, and most folks have explained to me that what we saw was just people were despondent over that. It was a punch to the gut. That Governor Snyder changed the rules, and that's just how it was, and people were demoralized. People resisted every step of the way in Detroit, which I think is really important to name and acknowledge. Like people like Cecily McClellan, who's a co-founder of We the People of Detroit, was a central part of Free Detroit No Consent that was resisting the consent decree that was a part of the bankruptcy proceedings. In response to the emergency management declaration, Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management was formed, which is DREM is the acronym. And we're out there in the city, incredibly active in staging demonstrations and trying to circulate information to, get people to understand what's going on. Because a lot of times, like, this policy stuff is so difficult to kind of put into layman's terms because it's so dense, and a lot of times by design. So the kinds of actions and organizing that they were leading, I think, helped to generate excitement and give people hope. Like, there's a lot of art and activism that was taking place, whether that was painting of water towers or graffiti around the city, or music and concerts and things like that. So there was a real effort to excite people and generate that kind of mobilization. And at the same time, like, people, and I think this is one of the key things to understand here, because it's how it's played out around the world, this kind of shock doctrine, as Naomi Klein describes it. During these periods of drastic structural adjustment and sweeping changes to society, there is just like wave after wave that's coming at people from all sides. So on the education front, that's school closures. With water, that's massive water shutoffs. With housing, that's evictions and foreclosures. And keep in mind, this is just a few years after the height of the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, and people are still reeling from having their homes foreclosed upon by the banks who are issuing these illegal subprime mortgages. So there's, and then, like, even like on a micro level, like, there's parceling out of city infrastructure like lighting and garbage collection. And there's just the picture I'm trying to paint here is that there's a very intentional onslaught of Black communities so as to stun people into immobility. And that's very much by design. We've seen that playbook happen here, throughout the country, or around the world. And it's meant to destabilize communities and to prevent massive organizing. And that's really the way that I've seen the current administration functioning over the past 4 years as well. It's been by design. When there's a massive policy proposal that's coming down the pipe, there's usually a few other like more minor or as serious either policies or just distractions that are coming along to keep people fighting on all fronts. And it's a lot of times unsustainable. So the question is, how is it possible to fight on all of these fronts at once? And really, the only way to do that, as people have explained it to me, is just to have more and more people out and in the streets and resisting. And that sadly wasn't the case here. Like, for the great work that DREM did and so many other folks did to slow down and challenge at every step the takeover of the city of Detroit, there just wasn't enough people to effectively resist, because we're talking about such great imbalance of power dynamics that so few people can enact such sweeping changes in the city of Detroit and elsewhere relatively swiftly. Because they have such great economic and political power. But in order to counteract that, you need such massive amounts of people power that are just really hard to amass when people are dealing with day-to-day crises.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned about the art and the activism. Someone had said something recently to me that people, humans hunger for art, for that, creation, and that gets us ready for activism. So I appreciate the reference to art. But, there are a lot of different groups that are working, not just obviously on the um, emergency management and sort of its consequences in the city, but on, for example, on issues having to do with evictions or foreclosures, there's so many active groups in Detroit. Can you give us a way of thinking about categories, or, sociologists, we like typologies. Are there different ways to think about the kinds of organizations that are out there? Because, from here, a bird's eye view, it just looks like there are hundreds of organizations. How do we make sense of it?
Yeah, and there are. And a lot of times people are working in coalition with each other. So organizations like coalitions like the People's Water Board is a massive a coalition of different organizations working for water security, access to clean, affordable water and the public trust. And that involves organizations that are in a range of different specific areas of focus, from like environmental justice to welfare rights to legal organizations as well, and labor organizations, all that have a direct interest in the water struggle. I think it's also important to name that there's class elements in this involved as well. Detroit has been, in a lot of ways, like ground zero for the nonprofit industrial complex, and nonprofit organizations have come into this city and emerged in this city in a way that has attempted to shape city politics and shape organizing work. And a lot of these nonprofit organizations don't have really a great degree of accountability to the people whose lives they're impacting. And organizers will tell you all about this when you talk to them, particularly in the field of education and the roles that nonprofit organizations have played there. Because, and so it's kind of like a funnel, right? When we talk about a nonprofit industrial complex, like massive amounts of money comes in, and the people who are giving that money can put leverage on the nonprofit to determine how that money is getting spent, what kind of organizations and what kind of demands can be made using that money, what kind of work can be done. It's very rare that grant money comes along without any kind of stipulations, or there's usually a rope that can be pulled. So at the end of the day, a lot of nonprofits are beholden to their funders to varying degrees, of course. So I think that's important to name, because there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that are massive here, and there's a lot of grassroots organizations that don't have the same level of funding and kind of institutional support, which is an important dynamic to understand in the city of Detroit. The way that I'm looking at it is that, to get to some of the categorizations, there's so many different areas of struggle. The system of white supremacy in the United States has so many different shapes, and it has its tentacles in so many different areas of our life, that there are so many different areas of struggle that we need to be fighting on. And so there's organizations like the Detroit Justice Center that work around issues of mass incarceration and prison abolition. And a lot of their work is done in the legal world. And they also, which isn't to say that that's all that they do. So there's not a lot of clear categories, and I don't want to like pigeonhole different organizations in that kind of way. They do a lot of legal work, and they also do a lot of organizing work, like some incredible work of exercising radical imaginations to work with young people and ask questions about, rather than investing these millions of dollars into a new Wayne County jail, how would you spend that money? And it's not, I don't think any of the respondents said another jail in the city of Detroit. There's organizations like Detroit Eviction Defense that does like direct action in trying to prevent evictions from being carried out. Where there was one dramatic moment a few years ago on the east side, on Manistee, where Detroit Eviction Defense and Freedom Growers and others built a fence around a house and declared it an eviction-free zone to prevent evictions from being carried out. There's organizations like We the People of Detroit's Community Research Collective that uses like serious data to gather evidence and to make claims and to study, analyze, and then build narratives around water inequity. So they recently came out with a study that demonstrated the correlation between water shutoffs and COVID-19 rates in the city of Detroit, which is critical for having that kind of information to then make demands upon policymakers and to, you know, be armed with that kind of information. So I without like kind of going down the list of all the organizations, I think what I would say is that there's so many people doing so many different things that if students are trying to get involved, like find an organizational home, which I think is so important in this current moment, that there is no shortage of organizations to get involved with that are usually looking for people to come and support, and also, I mean, enter respectfully into, which I think is a really important, I would be remiss to not include that as well, that there's so many organizations to reach out to, and it's important that we understand that the folks who are involved and been leading these organizations for so many years and been through so much in the city of Detroit, they are the experts in these fields. I'm essentially just compiling information and presenting it to you from the lens of a scholar. But the folks that have been doing this work on the front lines are the real experts in these topics. And if we're seeking as students or community members, or you know, however we're identifying, if we're seeking to engage in community organizing work, it's important that we enter respectfully and accountably within those spaces.
You know, I think this is such an important point. I know that Dean Thompson at Dearborn has done work on, you know, philanthropy in Detroit. And he makes a very interesting point. He looks at how much federal dollars are being brought into Detroit for redevelopment and how much, you know, foundation support is available for redevelopment. And of course, the foundations are heavily subsidizing what we're calling public-private partnerships, right? But the question is, who is that public? The public is whoever goes after those grant monies, and the foundation's priorities are determined often in Manhattan, you know, so, but certainly not in Detroit, right? In boardrooms outside of Detroit. And then the question of entering respectfully almost doesn't make sense, because there was really no entry. There was, here's this pot of money, who's gonna come and get it? There's really no, it's not just a question of public accountability, but it's almost like a complete disconnection, right, from the public.
Right, and when you describe it right like that, it is very much a colonial project of, you know, nonprofit organizations coming into communities, taking resources, and then making dictates within the communities about how those resources are to be used.
Well, I'm just echoing what other people have said. When you look at the fact that most of Detroit, the data shows, is worse off today than it was 10 years ago. And yet a lot of people come in from the suburbs and say, oh, Detroit is doing great, you know, look at the downtown. Well, but the problem, right, is that a lot of those public-private partnerships are focusing their spending on the downtown area at the expense of the rest of the city.
Mm-hmm. I want to name, because policing is such a hot issue right now, and we need to be talking about it. We need to deal with the realities of police violence and the functions of police in our society. That's another way that massive amounts of money come into the police apparatus in Detroit, as well as through foundations. And if you do the research and look at some of these foundations that are making contributions to the Detroit Police Department, whether that's monetary, whether that's service-based, if you look at who they're being funded by, it raises a lot of red flags. So for instance, the Detroit Public Safety Foundation, I might be getting the name slightly off, they have taken over $60,000, maybe more, I have the numbers elsewhere, from the Motorola Solutions Foundation, which is the same, it's the nonprofit arm of Motorola, which has over $35 million in contracts with the Detroit Police Department for its surveillance infrastructure. Yeah. So that raises a lot of questions in my mind, is how can, a foundation be accepting money? It just appears like a pay to play kind of situation, like getting contract money in exchange for financial contributions. And then you see another foundation that's supporting the DPD, that's led by Andy Arena, which is the former FBI chief in Detroit. There's so many red flags here about the way that money is coming into the city of Detroit and how it's being used. And that's not even to get to the corollary issue of public tax dollars being distributed to developers and corporations to attract their developments here, usually with very weak, if any, benefits to the community, because the city of Detroit and some of these developers essentially colluded to introduce a much weaker version of the community benefits ordinance than what we have, that we actually have now, when compared to what organizers were demanding several years ago. So we're seeing, like you said, massive amounts of money coming into the city of Detroit that aren't benefiting particularly Black Detroiters. And that's, sorry, I'll stop there.
I'm really grateful that you've taken time to talk to us today. And I feel like you've given us, marching orders for what we need to talk about next. Obviously we should talk about the Green Lights Project, who is subsidizing, right, the expansion of surveillance of Detroiters, right, at the expense of real safety, right? Because my list, big developers like Downtown Development Authority, the Community Benefits Agreement. There's a lot of things to talk about here. Following the money, I think, is a really good strategy. I think it keeps people honest in their analysis. So I really appreciate that you're doing the good work, that you're staying grounded with the people in, community-focused research, community-responsive research, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. And I really am very grateful for your time, and I'm sure my students are too, and Detroiters are too. So thank you very much, Peter Blackmer, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's good, always good to speak with you. I appreciate the chance to talk about some of these important issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks again. Have a good day. Have the best day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.